Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hola,
Hola
Manuel.
Ana, ¿cómo estás?
Bien,
Hola,
tú.
buenas noches a todos. Bienvenidos a una nueva actividad como parte del programa público de actividades de la Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Hoy seguimos con el ciclo Archivo Redux, es la transmisión número 24, un ciclo que comenzó el semestre pasado y siguió este semestre. Ahí tengo el retorno. Y ahí está. Bien. Es un ciclo que está coordinado por Ana Font, Ana es profesora de la escuela y coordinadora del Archivo de Arquitectura. Como les decía, Archivo Redux transmite registros y ediciones realizados por el Archivo de Arquitectura de actividades curriculares y extracurriculares de la Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos de los últimos años, reviviendo las ideas que circularon y fueron debatidas en la escuela en su historia reciente. Los contenidos editados son presentados nuevamente, renovando su interés cultural y potenciando su influencia disciplinar mediante su recontextualización temporal. Las transmisiones, en ese sentido, construyen una taxonomía de la cultura contemporánea mediante la singularización y la organización retrospectiva de sus posicionamientos, sus prácticas, discursos y sensibilidades. Y hoy vamos a transmitir una conferencia que dio Paul Preissner el 27 de septiembre de 2013, eh, Kind of Architecture.
Exacto, sí, estamos llegando a la última, ¿no, Manuel? Hoy es el último Redux del semestre, es el octavo y último del semestre, y es el último par, entonces también que presento, porque ya en el próximo vamos a empezar a hacer los pares recíprocos entre el primero y el segundo semestre. Y este último par, que son las prácticas, digamos, formalistas, entre paréntesis americanas, porque se trata de los dos pols y de hecho trabajan juntos bastantes veces, aunque en 2013 nos visitaron cada uno en distintos momentos, que son Paul Preissner, que es la conferencia que vamos a ver hoy, Kind of Architecture, y el semestre que viene vamos a ver la conferencia de Paul Anderson, Practice Plus, que también dio en 2013, pero un poco antes y no en ningún sentido vinculadas en ese momento. De todos modos, sabemos que trabajan juntos. De hecho, en este mes vimos la última colaboración que hicieron en la Bienal de Venecia, curaron el pabellón americano. Pero bueno, me parece que es interesante como hemos venido construyendo en este semestre la cuestión de los pares y de las relaciones entre los pares en esta voluntad de reconstruir esa contemporaneidad de las prácticas que hemos ido atravesando, que son estas prácticas formalistas en contraposición con algunas prácticas más matéricas o materialistas, que también trabajan problemas de escala, como cuando vimos hace un par de transmisiones el Critical Matter de Sergio Araya y a futuro las escalaridades de Sebastián Courian. Ese es el doble par con el que estamos un poco generando estas fricciones interesantes para dar luz uno sobre el otro. Y en ese sentido, la conferencia de hoy, la idea del kind of que Paul Preissner introduce en el Kind of Architecture de 2013, pero también recientemente ha publicado un libro que se llama Kind of Boring. Y creo que bueno, el común denominador es la idea de kind of y de esta voluntad de no nombrar de manera absoluta, sino de trabajar en el campo de qué es aquel algo que construye la arquitectura, y está embebido de una cierta crítica. Creo que a lo mejor pondría sobre la mesa hoy el hecho de que Paul Preissner en la conferencia de hoy va a hacer una estructura bastante ortodoxa de una doble crítica, o sea, una crítica de primer orden, una crítica de segundo orden y dos respuestas a esa crítica, más una propuesta de contribución a ese problema que plantea. En cambio, Paul Anderson por ahí opera más de facto dentro de la liviandad americana entre inverted commas, ¿no? Y no tanto explicitando una crítica. Entonces creo que ahí hay algo entre la explicitud y la operación desde adentro que los hace dialogar de ciertos modos. Entonces esto lo dejo un poco como inicio de esa doble relación. Y me concentro hoy en hablar de esto que estaba conceptualizando como una doble crítica en el caso de Paul, Él inicia la conferencia diciendo que la conferencia tiene 3 partes, una cosa más cronológica, como de una primera etapa, de una especie de reconocimiento y una segunda etapa, pero me parece que en realidad es una manera de pensar overall, que primero funda en especificar su formación en los años 90 en la Universidad de Illinois, que significa una formación en un momento que él mismo define como de intelectualización del software y de haber adquirido muchos skills sobre las formas animadas, los objetos, las curvas, los swopes, ¿no? Y como un momento clave en adquirir todos esos skills y esa manera de mirar la forma y de operar con la forma como un medio de animación y de transformación. Ese formalismo de la primera etapa lo lleva a empezar una práctica en la cual los proyectos se suceden uno al otro y donde las geometrías de un proyecto son el inicio del siguiente proyecto, con una especie de absoluta transferencia sin fricciones, donde la inversión está en las técnicas justamente de la deformación, del renderizado, y de cómo generar proyectos voluptuosos a nivel formal, que después se pueden articular a la construcción con sistemas de precast, ¿no? Y tiene como toda una solvencia en poder transformar la forma a ser construida, en arquitecturizar la forma, ¿no? Y él mismo comenta cómo en su práctica académica puede pensar de una manera más abstracta sobre los problemas de diseño y después en la oficina encontraron los modos de arquitecturizarlos y volver los objetos construibles, ¿no? Entonces ese es como el background, la base donde se asienta. Y creo que desde ahí es donde proyecta la primera reflexión, digamos, o reflexión crítica, que es esta facilidad, este fluir entre la geometría compleja y las técnicas de software que ponen en juego un sistema de valores de la forma que le parece ya demasiado smooth, demasiado difícil de argumentar, o sea, como que se puede argumentar ya de tantas maneras que se vuelve inargumentable, blando y que básicamente puede hacer de todo, ¿no? Esa pérdida de fricción es la que le genera una primera respuesta, una primer turn, que me parece interesante también por el hecho de que creo que él mismo está personificando le llamo respuesta porque creo que hubo en esos mismos momentos reacciones opuestas, ¿no? Reacciones en otras prácticas, en otros espacios de pensamiento que son literalmente reaccionarios a ese mismo, digamos, a esa misma identificación de un problema. Entonces me parecía muy curioso leer, en este caso, la identificación del problema por alguien que está trabajando desde adentro y que va a generar un cambio, pero bueno, sabemos que también hubo reacciones más radicales totalmente contrapuestas a seguir pensando la arquitectura de ese modo, ¿no? Entonces hay algo interesante para discutir a lo mejor después. Y también, bueno, eso, que la respuesta que tiene Paul a esa identificación, a eso que lo inquieta, tiene que ver con ir a buscar una producción de los objetos separados entre la geometría y aquello que es una especie de diseño gráfico de patrones que se le superimponen a las geometrías y que generan un extrañamiento de escalas y de comportamientos que lo que hacen es volverse la arquitectura misma. O sea, la representación que se le superimpone a los objetos se vuelve en sí esa arquitectura y genera claramente ese vuelco a que estos edificios se vuelven menos problemas de conversación urbana y más el problema del objeto más autónomo, ¿no? Y creo que también ahí hay algo del West Coast y seguramente del Triple O, que él no comenta para nada, pero bueno, como esa también corriente paralela que vemos. Entonces me parece que hay algo, lo digo entre paréntesis, muy interesante en la charla de Paul, que es que no está nombrando estas otras, digamos, situaciones que están pasando en paralelo, pero me parece que están latentes, ¿no? Entonces explicita hasta cierto punto. Entonces, dada ese reconocimiento, esa respuesta, creo que hay una crítica o una reflexión de segundo orden que va a producir una respuesta de segundo orden, que es una preocupación de que la arquitectura en realidad se vuelve incapaz de captivar culturalmente, ¿no? Para él el problema como último, más allá del de la forma y de la expertise formal, es la autoconciencia de la arquitectura, de saberse fuera de lugar, por poder reproducirse de cualquier modo, justamente por la viabilidad de la manufactura de la arquitectura, que hace que se pueda transportar y resolver de cualquier manera, y eso considera que la vuelve narcisista y demasiado seria, de una manera autoimportante más que realmente seria, ¿no? Y esa crítica de segundo orden es la que lo hace traer una idea, que es la idea del humor, y de cómo justamente estos objetos de los que hablaba recién tienen un aspecto emocional que hace que no tengan una relación de lugar tampoco, pero que establezcan una relación de carácter. Entonces, en ese sentido, introduce lo que le llamaría unos principios de este humor. Creo que estos no los nombra de esta manera, es un modo también de conceptualizar la conferencia, en el sentido de que va comentando lo que leo como 6 principios del humor, y que son el problema de escala, ¿no? Cuanto más grande es un objeto, más se lo trabaja para que parezca pequeño, ¿no? Como un extrañamiento de la escala de una miniatura que en realidad es un edificio monumental, del embarrassment, de los proyectos que se esconden atrás de otros edificios para no ser vistos, de la idea de juguete y de la forma inorgánica, que es como que lleva a la sensación de que puedes tenerlo, como poseer ese objeto y no tanto tener una experiencia adentro de la arquitectura. El cuarto sería la idea de misfit, pone como ejemplo los trajes de David Byrne en los 80 en Talking Heads, ¿no? Como la idea esa de que el patrón y la geometría tienen un misfit que lo hace una condición oversize. Y después las últimas dos son la idea de anti-ambición y de messy, ¿no? de desorden, ¿no? Como todos llevan a una serie de imperfecciones, y creo que esas imperfecciones son una idea de humor, ¿no? Es una idea particular de humor, también culturalmente arraigada en una cierta manera de ver el humor, y también me da la sensación de que están vinculadas con la herencia de la animación del primer momento, de haber trabajado desde el aprendizaje de la idea de animación, ¿no? Que él comenta bien al inicio, porque en lugar de trabajar con un proceso de diferenciación de curvas, digamos, trabaja con la diferenciación de carácter en esos objetos, y esos objetos son objetos que son representaciones de alto nivel, digamos, técnico, ¿no? En ese sentido. Y bueno, la conclusión, creo que la conclusión que trae es doble, una que me parece que revincula con el contexto americano, que es la idea de suburbanidad, de cómo justamente esta arquitectura se vincula de manera extraña, y creo que hay una extrañeza en la suburbanidad americana que le encaja muy bien a este problema de extrañeza. Pero después hay otro que también de vuelta es más macro, ¿no? Y creo que siempre va a haber como esas dos cosas, y el que es más macro es lo que él considera su propia contribución, que es la idea de entretenimiento, y el entretenimiento como un problema no de espectáculos, sino de carácter y de sensibilidad. Y pone un ejemplo muy, muy lindo, digamos, que comenta cómo durante miles de años hubo muy pocas razas de perros, y cuando los perros dejaron de ser necesarios para la caza o para otros, digamos, dejaron de ser staff dentro del household y pasaron a ser pets, ahí se empezaron a diversificar muchísimo más los tipos, ¿no? Entonces, él dice que a la arquitectura le pasa lo mismo, que la arquitectura ya no tiene un propósito en sí funcional, entonces, porque, no sé, se reformulan, ¿no? Se hace un refurbishment de edificios enteros, pierden esa idea de función, y se vuelve entonces un tipo de entretenimiento. Y ahí es donde se inscribe y de algún modo se entiende que está empujando la disciplina. Es un proyecto, entiendo, disciplinarista, pero que la empuja en una dirección tratada más como artística que como tecnológica, y es algo que también él plantea literalmente en la conferencia. Así que Nada, sí, por ahí me extendí un poquito más hoy, pero me parece que era un argumento complejo y muy interesante y muy vigente también para revisar.
Sí, no, es muy interesante. Estaba pensando lo que decías de la doble crítica, que era como una respuesta a un momento de la arquitectura que decías. Bueno, la primera sería la pérdida de fricción, ¿no? Y,
Claro.
y la segunda sería el agotamiento como de capital cultural, una cosa así, como o de
Ujú.
convocatoria, o de incidencia, o de agencia, si querés.
Sí,
Entonces, eh, hmm. No, estaba pensando que eso es muy interesante porque en sí, antes de pensar en cuáles son las respuestas que da Paul Preissner, en sí es como permitiría construir una genealogía de, de los distintos tipos de reacciones que tiene, porque me parece que es una crítica compartida por personas en apariencia, arquitectos de apariencia disímil, o
ujú,
de ideologías disímiles, o gustos, eh, ¿no? O sea, me parece que es
sí,
interesante porque es como un nudo del que ramifican eh, muchas respuestas distintas. Y en este caso, claro, la primera que sería, yo lo pensaba como estoy como repasando lo que dijiste, porque sí, no,
sí,
la
sí.
primera sería como la liviandad, ¿no? O sea, se va.
Ujú.
Sí. No, claro, estaba pensando cómo vuelve una freak. Sí. Es interesante, es como un problema, porque como que vuelve la liviandad un problema de fricción, que es como creo que la liviandad es fricción en el momento en el cual está como la autoimposición o la forzadura a la liviandad misma, ¿no? O sea, como
Claro,
a nunca ser nunca ser. Se podría decir que eso es una forma de pesadez, pero me parece que eso es un tema en sí mismo, pero digamos, es interesante como sí, hay como una agenda de ser liviano, o de que sea arquitectura liviana, eh,
sí. Mm. Sí, sí, o sea, me parece que lo que es interesante que es que lo que te está haciendo pensar en parte es no querer tampoco volver muy explícito, como poner toda la constelación que tienes en la cabeza en este momento sobre la mesa, pero creo que eso justamente también es lo que sucede que Paul viene a decir que no es un problema justamente de la forma por la forma, que sería como, bueno, sino que lo vincula a un agotamiento también del sentido y esa recuperación del sentido que la hace pasar por cierto lugar que no es justamente aparte, sino que es como si reconociera una falta que es cultural, ¿no? Y eso, sí, me parece que es bastante particular esa combinación. Y nada, sería la novedad, digamos, de esa combinación como singular, ¿no?
claro.
Hmm,
No, y después claro, pensaba que después en principio, no sé, la pérdida el reconocimiento de la pérdida de fricción no sé, la incorporación de técnicas y herramientas digitales y pensadas de esa manera igual, genera como la bifurcación liviandad-pesadez, ¿no? Como que uno podría reconocer los que ante eso lo volvieron pesado y no sé, un retorno a éticas anteriores a eso y así. Y después pensaba en el agotamiento del capital cultural, que esa es como más difícil, ¿no? O sea, el agotamiento de la agencia, del agenciamiento cultural. eh, es interesante que sea el humor la respuesta ante eso, ¿no? Es como una. Sí,
Claro, él articula que en realidad todos los otros campos lo contienen, ¿no? Artísticos, y la arquitectura no. como también algo, no sé, digo, si te, te inspira eso.
Sí, sí, claro, es
Pero es un cierto
interesante.
humor, ¿no? Sí,
¿Por qué
o sea,
por qué los otros pueden?
ujú,
Sí, está bien. No, sí, no, y después, claro, pensaba que tiene, al menos que me parece que, como vos lo planteás, que es muy interesante, es como una disección casi como de un personaje, en el sentido de que tiene como su carácter y sus formas de comportamiento. Tiene algo como de bufón, pero en el sentido no en el sentido peyorativo, sino en el sentido de eh, aquel que tiene la autorización para decir lo que otros no pueden, digamos, o autoautorización, como que
ujú,
¿no? Tiene algo como eso, y pensaba como el multicolor también, el uso del color, tiene una cosa como, eh, que creo que igual muy sofisticado dentro de eso, pero eh, sí.
sí, sí.
Incluso por lo menos por como vos lo planteabas, tiene algo como de el bufón en el sentido de que está como anunciando algo, está como cumpliendo una función de que tal o cual cosa no se olvide, sí.
Mm. Sí, a mí lo que me interesa mucho de cuando vuelves a ver la charla y ves las imágenes y después entras en la web de Paul, no ves esas imágenes, o no, algunas solo, que, que es que no hay, realmente para mí es interesante porque no, justamente no hay una ideología moralista al respecto de nada de esto. Es una práctica continua y evoluciona, y tiene ese momento que además culturalmente, no sé, en UIC, en esos años, yo me acuerdo que bueno, estaba Luis Ortega también y obviamente Paul Anderson y Bob Somol, que es el decano o director, no sé cómo se llama el rol exactamente, que tiene ahí, y se está generando esas fricciones, o sea, internas incluso a la escuela, ¿no? Y de que esté sucediendo esa propuesta y estén sucediendo las propuestas que están al lado que no son exactamente iguales, y ahí había un centro de pensamiento de cierto orden que después también ha evolucionado hacia otros lados, pero me parece que no es nada, tiene algo como muy en sí, tiene algo muy de estar pensando y haciendo, y además no es nada desconectado, o sea, creo que tiene una precisión temporal muy alta, o sea, como un sentido, como de sentir en qué está la arquitectura, como una conexión muy fuerte digamos, en tiempo y forma de estar en el Midwest americano, como en ese momento. Y de hecho, me parece que no conozco tanto lo que qué es esto del kind of boring y en qué dirección está yendo, pero creo nada, que siempre que escucho un poco si Paul está haciendo algo es para saber cómo lo está sintiendo la arquitectura en este momento, en ese sentido. Creo que lo de la sensibilidad es como el sentir culturalmente la arquitectura como práctica, ¿no? Y entonces,
Claro.
obviamente, esa sensación es propia, ¿no? No es universal. Pero creo que eso
Claro,
podría ser
sí,
también.
digamos, eso que decís me da pie a otra cosa que estaba pensando con tu presentación, que era, eh, no es frecuente que uno se encuentre con un arquitecto que tiene como un pensamiento sobre el presente y hace el trabajo de volverlo un problema de gusto, pero un gusto con mayúsculas, digamos, el gusto no como lo personal, subjetivo, inalienable, sino como algo construido y con una sensibilidad construida con otras cosas, más allá de que la está construyendo, como vos. Me parece que es algo de lo que decís. Me parece que es interesante porque eso está bastante al frente, digamos. Es más frecuente encontrar como diagnósticos sobre el presente o cómo la arquitectura va a conseguir mayor agencia en el mundo y no sé cuánto.
Claro.
Pero detrás en el fondo hay una serie de gustos que quedan como en el fondo. Acá parece estar bastante al frente de la cosa.
Sí, sí, como que el antiheroísmo lleva en realidad a esa especie de
Claro.
autoría. Eso está bueno.
Mm.
Ujú. Sí. Bueno, veamos esto, terminamos con una alegremente con estas prácticas y empezaremos el próximo semestre de vuelta con las conversaciones, así que volveremos a... Bueno, igual está esto del lado dionisíaco y apolíneo que armaste con el SEAC en los 2 semestres, así que cambiará un poco el tono.
Buenísimo. Bueno, Ana, muchas gracias. Vemos
Gracias a ti,
la
Manuel.
conferencia de Paul Preissner.
Chao.
Hasta luego.
Anyway, so I think, hi, I'm Paul. Thanks for having me. The way that I've kind of formatted the lecture, there's maybe 3 or 4 parts. The first part I'm going to kind of just breeze through the early history of my office, the kind of work we were interested in. And I'm doing this in part because I think there's a pretty significant change of the more recent interest that I kind of have for what I do. And then I'll kind of, there's some jokes in the middle, and then new work. So 3 parts. And I think to kind of maybe organize this around the general lecture theme, the early parts of my office, I was heavily interested in kind of software as a way to develop new forms in architecture. I was interested in all of the kind of, I guess, predictable things that architects who like software and technology are, whether it's movie special effects, these kind of grotesque and kind of animated shapes and objects and swoops and curves. I think part of that came from my own education at Columbia University at a time in the end of the 90s when software was kind of being intellectualized within the institution much more aggressively than it was in the practice, or the way that kind of offices were. So I think as a kind of student, we were kind of working on things that were kind of new to the world, and so I think that tethering between our research interests as a university and kind of architectural disciplinary interest as a profession were very similar. I think that kind of ethos or kind of spirit of things continues on today. So the kind of work that I do with students at the university, I think is kind of, could best be considered maybe like the abstract design interests that then later my office tries to figure out how to architecturalize or turn into kind of projects. This was just the first, this was maybe like the 5th project my office did. It was a competition for a 6,500 square meter museum of prehistory in the Incheon Peninsula. So just kind of South Korea, almost right near the border between South and North Korea. We took second, and it kind of enabled me to both financially and kind of interest-wise to start the practice more in full. I think all the kind of shapes are something that now is not unexpected, these kind of voluptuous volumes, these kind of curves, the kind of tethering between landscape geometry, object geometry, material geometry, to where there's a kind of real biologic sensibility to these things. The early work continued that way, so basically, quite literally, curves from one project would then be reused to start the initial geometries for future investigations. So curves from the landscape of this project went into early diagrams for a park within South Korea, that went into library volumes for Czechoslovakia, that went into observation towers for South Korea or Seoul, kind of our structural investigations of that. Basically one project bled into the next, and all of these things were very heavily invested in techniques like animation, deformation, curve geometry. I think as we kind of went through, one of the things that I felt was kind of interesting to do was to get more invested into rendering as well. This was a project, it was a kind of panelization project that we did for a 72-story office building in Beijing. We had no kind of design role for the interior of it. It was just to kind of develop a precast modular system that we could produce a unique facade for. And just because of the way that precast panels work, if you have, say, 2 million precast panels, you don't have only one mold for all of them. You end up with probably one mold for every 43 panels you make. So being that there were, we had about 1,000 different molds anyway, that gave us the ability to create at least 1,000 unique shapes. So we were able to, with a precast system, produce a project that looked a bit more organic and somewhat irregular, and in that case maybe damaged. I mean, the second interest why we were doing these projects was always how we kind of used software as a way to simulate the presentations of them, to produce these kind of renderings. And while at first it was always kind of an interest to just produce more photorealistic responses, I think we got interested in the kind of artistry of these things, to where they start looking more anally, more abstract, fuzzier, and I think the aesthetics kind of show up later on. This was a museum for Poland. Again, working with panelization and the idea that those kind of intersections of panels could produce these apertures that produce spots that then get illuminated in the evening. This was a project in Kentucky. But every project is kind of part of a family of projects. And at some point, I just started to get a little bit bored with all of it, mostly because it seemed too familiar. It no longer felt like a kind of ideological challenge, because I think at this point, this project was in 2009 or 10, maybe or 11. This was an opera in Korea. At this point, it seemed no one was contesting or really refuting the notion that complicated geometry, software-driven techniques were viable forms for architecture. It's kind of, everyone thinks that is okay, and one way you do it. My own personality made that all of a sudden not interesting to me anymore. I think I was always the kind of kid that if my parents agreed to something, then I no longer wanted to do it. Because that's kind of how I always felt. So all of these kind of shapes just started to seem too smooth, too inarguable, kind of soft. And at this point, the techniques were worked out, the deployments worked out, and the only thing that matters is whether you have access to kind of the exorbitant capital and budgets to realize it. Something that I both don't have and also probably won't get for a while. So I needed to find another way to kind of produce interest in the work for myself. And so one of the things I started to do was to play with very kind of simple graphic patterns, very big, scaled up to the degree that they don't fit entirely on the project themselves. They're meant to be read not as individual material panels, but as these kind of oversized graphic representations that start to work as the architecture themselves. Still maintaining a kind of relationship between the site and the project so that it's all kind of cohesive interaction, but then also introducing the notion of kind of mistakes or ill fit. So using different sizes of stripes, having them offset. Within even the panelization of the glass material for the opera, the idea would be to have 3 different scales of triangulation that kind of then offset each other. So it wasn't something that just indexes the geometry, but something that actually works outside of it. Almost as though there's 2 projects that are kind of ignorant of each other. There's the kind of geometric project and the graphic project, and they just happen to coexist within the same space. It's just kind of the interior of it. And then kind of continuing that out. But at the same time, I think this started to make me interested less in the specific shape of the project and more interested in how this kind of interaction between these kind of goofy, syrupy geometries and these very understood, legible, designed graphic patterns start producing a reduction in the perceivable scale of the work itself. So they start looking more like these little toys or kind of objects as opposed to architectural projects. And I think it's always been my interest to kind of have architecture not look like architecture. Not in a kind of, I guess, normal way where you're just hiding details, but in a way that it doesn't quite even feel like it belongs within an urban conversation. These things are more in the realms of like pets or toys that you would have, but at a scale that is much, much bigger. You obviously couldn't pick these up. This was a library in Helsinki, Finland. So anyway, all those things kind of made me start to dramatically rethink what my architectural interests were, and I think it also gave me a point to start relaunching maybe the ideological ambitions of the office itself. And I mostly started with patterns and shapes, and then migrating that through some work that I did with students at the university, like into these later projects. So that kind of brings me to the official title for the lecture, which is Excellent Ordinary Architectures or Clumsy Forms for Minor Objects, or totally being okay with being only kind of okay, but somewhat And so I started to try and figure out what was boring me about contemporary architecture. Not just mine, but I think my colleagues, people I don't even know. Generally, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, I've started to find most new architecture, while interesting for a number of kind of pragmatic reasons, kind of very dull, predictable, and maybe a little bit too obnoxious for more artistic or cultural reasons. And I think the main reason is that it's always too venomously serious, in a sense. So there's no such thing as avant-garde or vanguard without there being such a kind of dead seriousness to the pursuit, that it's not only of utmost world importance, but actually that the projects themselves don't even have a kind of self-awareness to their own, out-of-placeness. Part of that, I think, is kind of expansion of both global financial ability, manufacturing capabilities, design abilities, have more or less eliminated any type of shape as an architectural problem, because we can figure them all out at this point. So then the differences between projects started to seem so small that architecture started to feel to me a bit too narcissistic. What I started to find interesting is how you could produce humor within architecture, because it seems the one maybe emotional aspect of work that doesn't quite have a place. And I don't only look at or find interest in architecture. I like other things like movies and television and stand-up comedy, and painting and comics and all that. And more or less every other artistic pursuit seems to have developed a very sophisticated sense of humor, whereas architecture has only the most kind of basal sense of humor, which is this, more or less. Like when somebody tries to produce a joke with an architectural project, it inevitably is some version of this, which is the kind of cliched architectural typology turned upside down. You've seen this sketch like billions of times. Everyone always feels it's very provocative as a kind of idea, but I now have a collection of over 500 images of upside down house structures around the world. This one's in a suburb of Prague. This one's in Arizona. This one's in Wisconsin. This one's also, I don't remember where this one is. This one's kind of funny because they chose the wrong house to turn upside down. You can't really tell. You chose a house with a flat roof. So you can only really tell because the plants grow down. And then you can see the balconies are upside down. So whoever their bad architect was even worse because it picked an illegible formal device. But they just keep coming, and I think in some ways this seems both immediately novel and then kind of entirely forgettable. And it also seems somewhat typical of the kind of more iconographic or kind of exuberant projects of architecture in general, which is that you have a very immediate reaction and effect to them. In this case, it's supposed to be a little snicker because you get the joke. I think this is the most modest of all of them. It's just like a real cheap one. But inevitably, like, the joke wears off very quickly. And I think that the same thing is true of now the more expressive and expensive architectural projects, is that they're very immediately provocative, and then that kind of feeling wears off rather quickly. And then you're left with a kind of empty shell of a project that no longer has any ability to culturally captivate. I think with an upside-down house as a way to pursue jokes, the problem is you always have to then put stairs to get into the door, which is way up at the top. So further kind of distancing someone from ever really appreciating it. This one even has a very long ramp. And then sometimes they even use it as a kind of artistic prop, and you just throw it on top of another more normal building. Anyway, all that made me think that there's a big problem with architecture not ever having been able to develop the sense of humor about the work that is being done. And I kind of think architecture is not only a built product, but every kind of architectural project is also definitionally an idea about architecture. So it's kind of, as it's self-reflected by nature, it should actually have a much more developed humorous palette to it. This is you guys know Garfield? It's a very not funny comic strip by Jim Davis that's in newspapers that I grew up with as a kid, and it's about this cat who's kind of a jerk. He doesn't really like the dog. He doesn't like Mondays, but he always talks back. He's very cynical and sarcastic. And then there's two artists who've kind of done appropriations of it, and the first one has gone through every Garfield strip and removed Garfield from it. So it's always these kind of initial reactions that they kind of make sense in the world of comics as long as there's a cartoon cat to talk to, but now he's just saying it to empty space, so it makes John look crazy. I always thought these were kind of funny, but the more provocative one to me is this really simple one where this artist replaced Garfield with a real cat. So now the cat does what normal cats do, which is just looks at you. It doesn't give you any kind of emotional feedback. And I don't know, like in a way I think, this requires the initial comic, but I think the sense of humor is much more subtle, and I've seen this for maybe 8 years now, and I still really enjoy it. The other thing is, like, the internet, I think, is really great at giving me things that are funny. And I guess what I mean by funny is things that aren't necessarily a joke that you can understand, that has a kind of lead-in, a particular punchline, and then a way that you're supposed to expect it, but just really strange objects that people either like or find fascinating and somewhat share. People who dress up in panda bear outfits that then make them wear Chinese clothing, or really bad paintings. I think not in the sense of amateur art, but just professional art by really talentless painters, I find very, very kind of funny. So these kind of amateur mistakes or immature behaviors, or these kind of like strange occurrences of the bears sitting at a picnic table. So you can start to kind of like talk with him in a way. It's kind of strange combinations that seem initially stupid. Or people doing, he's getting his portrait painted. The guy's actually doing it. Newspaper clippings. But anyway, I think like there's a whole, I guess, field of funny things that don't rely on a particular joke. They don't rely on a semantic understanding or any kind of awareness of the field to begin with. I don't think you need to know, and you don't, like, this doesn't have to be fun. But even if it is, it doesn't require you to understand the history of photography or kittens or even schoolboys or rich people. And so I guess like I started to try and find how to exploit that kind of deficiency within architecture to produce projects that are not merely advancing a kind of technological agenda. They're not advancing a particular agenda of wealth, so they're not refinement of modernism. They don't fetishize the past or nostalgia or materials or history, but somehow they're outside of all those conventional discussions, and they can start producing an architecture that is, let's say, abnormal or awkward or kind of clumsy, something that doesn't immediately feel wrong, but also not spectacular or noteworthy, but at the same time has enough subtle imperfections in it that it keeps developing as a kind of image as it goes on. So there's these, I've never figured out who these are from. I don't know what it is, but it's an architectural model of 3 towers, and they're very crooked. I really cannot stop enjoying the kind of way that reveals itself. I think the other thing is, like, sadness always seems to be part of humor outside of architecture, like with Bear that no one showed up to his birthday party. That was very funny. But so I think, for me, like, what I started doing research-wise, and just kind of also personally, because I like art, is looking at the way artists have dealt with shape and color and form and geometry, and produced artistic work that is, interesting or kind of uninteresting, but either way, somehow neither remarkably advanced, but also not remedial at the same time. So whether it's sculptors like Anne Truitt, who use pretty simple shapes, but then the way that she kind of applies colors so that they never actually index changes in the material, the kind of line between orange and red is actually just 2 centimeters off of the kind of separation of forms in here. These kind of artificial scalings of people within photographs. I kind of like this artist a lot. Like, there's nothing really remarkable about the subjects. There's rabbits, there's a guy. I mean, they're in a kind of strange or forced position, but what's most interesting to me is the superposition of a color theory on top of a formal sculptural theory, that its only relationship to each other is the kind of simultaneous occurrence of both, right? So there's this kind of green band that reads as though it is existent within the space that these two are part of. It doesn't really do anything for the rabbits. It doesn't tell us anything more about the individual. It doesn't really connect them together more than they are. And it's kind of rude in the sense that it ignores the ears and it just kind of includes the fingertips. And he's done these with a lot of things. So these kind of like simultaneous interactions of 2 different artistic theories at the same time produce, I think, a kind of formal work that has a depth to its interest that doesn't really have any immediate source for its root. Not a kind of historical project. There's just some people on hills. And I think I'm also starting to refer to softer colors or maybe unfashionable patterns or kind of holes in tires. But whether it's sculpture or painting, it's kind of Wade Putin, who does these kind of offset ink prints. So these are all computer prints with misalignments of paper, or kind of patterns and colors that are a little bit too out of date, or technological imperfections that start to produce new shapes that also at the same time don't feel romantic or beautiful. They start to look surreal and kind of disturbing in a sense. So I don't know if you know him. I mean, he's a photographer that uses a rolling shutter, so as the person's moving, you're getting this kind of motion distortion blurred into a single image. But a lot of these, I think, start to be more abstract ideas, and then this happened, which I found really funny. So in this little town was this fresco of Jesus on this church by Martinez in the 19th century. And then over time, it deteriorated like they do. And it looked like it did in the middle, which is to say, it just looks like an older version, the paint's kind of chipped away. This lady, Cecilia Gomez, who lived there. I think she was like 84, or is 84. Deeply religious, loves the little town, goes to church, at church like 2 or 3 times a day. She asked the priest if she could repair it. She loved it so much, and they said okay. So she took her, she got her paintbrushes and everything, and then she fixed it, and it looks like it does on the right. So, and the entire town, this became this was a huge story. Like the New York Times ran a long article on it. People wanted to imprison her for defacing this historic picture of Jesus. Somehow I actually found the kind of absolute poor quality of painterly techniques in the updated version to be much more interesting and enjoyable and kind of funny because of just the kind of blatant mistakes that were made. And it's certainly better than the first one, which is kind of just an unremarkable portrait. I mean, it's a fine portrait of Jesus, but it's not as good as Cecilia. But so, furniture artists kind of have started looking at these things. Here's 2 artists, this kind of bench that exists within this field of chairs. They kind of both merged into each other, painter techniques. And a lot of these things start getting smaller. I think all of this made me start feeling more convinced that the better way to produce an architecture is one that doesn't ever really support its own facts in that sense. So it works better when it subverts its own reality. So architecture is inherently big. Even small architecture is quite large and heavy. So I think the best thing any project could do is the larger it gets, the more minuscule it should feel. The techniques to do that should be things like, these are video mistakes or photograph copies or sad bears. But the idea is that the bigger an object becomes, the more it should actually work to produce a kind of smallness about itself, both conceptually and then kind of physically. So the first thing I started doing was we ran a sequence within the design studios I teach, one of the things we tried to do was identify what clumsy form might be, or a form that isn't trying to be beautiful, or any variation of that, or cool, or advanced, or romantic, nothing serious, but these kind of objects that would be thought of as towers, and only middle-sized towers, so not very large buildings, but also not small buildings, but ways that they could formalize mistakes. So a lot of these things try and physically embody in an architectural form what we could observe from television or funny pictures or things like that. So having legs of different sizes, being put together improperly, being furry, things that seem kind of inappropriate for architectural reasons. Buildings that are out of shape or have a kind of big belly, fatness, softness, crocheted buildings. So really kind of using artistic practices and techniques that are inherently small and assuming that they scale up to a kind of much larger size, or these kind of perfect cubes produced by very bad stacking. So everything's kind of slightly crooked or bent. They're kind of like pizza box, tower, bad cuts, pillows, things like that. Many pillows. And then also I think, most of these didn't have any real color exploration, but I think looking at colors that people don't tend to like brown. This is a kind of collection of all of them. And then what we did is we kind of took that, or the next year, with a different group of students, we took that a little bit further, and instead of just thinking of it as a kind of physical exercise to produce a set of cube models, to actually kind of look through it as a much more urban scale problem, in ways that buildings could be not invisible, but at the same time not the center of attention. So to produce a set of projects that seem embarrassed about their own condition, so that their desire is to always kind of hide and tuck away behind other buildings. So you always only see parts of these things, whether they're high, I think at least for me, like in television, there's always that really fat guy that tries to stand behind a tree when he's escaping from the cops and they see him because his belly sticks out. So using those types of humorous techniques and applying them to kind of architectural examples. A lot of these started to get kind of a little, pretty loud, but the idea is that nothing ever is really the focus. The kind of main architectural project is something that shouldn't really be the center of your attention. It should always kind of be of secondary or tertiary attention. produce a minimum architecture or kind of minuscule architecture, one that starts to feel more handheld and more object-like as opposed to kind of experience-like. So we have a whole set of these kind of slides that we can kind of go through, and sometimes they get close to lining up. So also kind of, I guess, trying to explore things that are just not right, like kind of close, kind of this, but not exactly anything. So they're kind of the same yellow, and the stripes are kind of the same, but they're a little offset, and one's kind of more reflective. This notion of partiality or incompleteness or kind of like sloppiness, I think, to exploit is a much more ambitious formal agenda for things of scale. So you get bad pinks with weird greens and lavenders. And also trying to find ways that we can produce large-scale formal objects that actually are able to project qualities about them that make us feel sorry for them. I think no one ever feels sorry for a building. You might feel sorry for the owner of the building. But I think it's like, for me at least, it's very difficult to look at things like this kind of poorly colored brown object with a big back and not feel that it's embarrassed as well. And knows and is well aware of his imperfections. So we've been doing this for a couple of years now, and have developed a pretty good set of lots of these things. Even starting to treat maybe, I think what's most interesting to me about this is the kind of softness between the color bands, where striping is kind of now removed. So at huge scale, you get the same types of effects that you would have with a teenager trying to paint, a wall or something like that with spray paint. But then even more than that, the way that the kind of brown initially seems like it should participate with the building itself, but it's like the earth was bumped. So you see that the part of the surface that was not covered, that was covered when it was being painted. Back oranges. All of them started to make me think that maybe, I started to get really deeply interested in these things because they seem to produce architectures that no longer look like buildings, which was always the kind of case before, but in that sense they looked like something recognizable, right? Whereas the kind of organic, software-driven shapes, while they didn't produce something that looks like a teddy bear, there were these kind of abstractions and geometries, but they always initially looked animal-like or bug-like. Like they had qualities and characteristics that were associated with other things that we all know. I think getting into just shapes, where this now starts just looking like tablecloth covering spheres, toilet paper rolls, balloon animals. Like none of these things are actually alive objects. They're all kind of inanimate, whether industrial designed or kind of purchased or even just kind of happenstantial occurrences. And all of these are fake. I mean, none of it in the sense that these aren't physical models, they're just renderings. So what we're trying to do is figure out ways that the presentation of the product itself, like architecture itself, can actually start to look like it's a photograph of an actual thing, not a rendering of a proposed thing, and not building the model so perfectly it's a well-constructed model, but to kind of fake the smallness of these things. So it looks the same as if you're photographing a plastic set of plates for an advertisement for your kid or something. Which then, this is the first, so that a lot of that was work done with the students. This was kind of built off of that, but a little bit in the middle of it for an exhibition at the University of Illinois Chicago called Primitive Forms. The notion of the exhibition was to, similar to the kind of like Logier's hut and the kind of idea or the notion that architecture has this root sense of self, whether it's four columns and a roof, whether it's like Le Corbusier's domino house, the kind of irreducible moment of architecture that actually produces a kind of atmospheric effect. And I think for me at the time it was the simultaneous combination of patterning, kind of superfluous or weird shapes, and then adherence to regulations at the same time. So whereas initial work was very wild, in the sense that it on purpose didn't respect boundaries, it didn't seem like it had an edge. There's a kind of combination of both primitive geometry, or these kind of platonic solids, flush edges, with weird kinks, the way that the striping both kind of initially seems like it's indexing the geometry and producing a topography of it, but it's really just kind of crooked and going in a diagonal, doesn't really match the one on the ground, but at the same time connects it with the same piece. And then we just produced a kind of physical model of these things. So, in some sense, I think this is a description of the idea that architecture isn't just a building, but it's also an idea about a building. And in some senses, getting to the idea of the building is probably the more important pursuit. These are faded in the sense that the pursuit of architecture itself for the work that we've been doing is trying to produce projects that are much more ghost-like or kind of within the background, at the same time being outlier forms or kind of odd shapes. This was a project that we did it was a competition project for a school campus within Greece. So it was both a kind of kindergarten, secondary school, and a primary school or a high school, and then an administrative office. And then using these kind of, I guess, etymology of the work is that it started initially with a bunch of platonic shapes, but they developed some corners that were curved, different roof heights, and then they kind of interact with these soft colors, these kind of pale pinks, these bled yellows, and then they get intersected with the kind of circulatory moments in the building, these staircases that produce these big gray noses on the buildings. All these things are kind of purposely done to seem very ill thought through, as though we somehow couldn't, finding shapes that don't optimize what's going on within it. They actually somehow don't fit things properly. So there's the band, the Talking Heads, was this kind of art rock band in the 80s, when David Byrne always wore these massive suits, like suits for somebody that was four times the size of him. So the idea that you get these kind of new pleasures, and these pleasures are kind of comical or humorous, they're not necessarily a joke, but you just get them from prosthetic noses, bad color patterns, and they also might start to produce new forms of public space. So instead of the four buildings kind of formalizing a courtyard for all the students, what the kind of reduction in size of these things have done, these secondary platforms that each building is with on, that leads into these kind of courtyards in between it, gives both a holistic plaza for the entirety of the school, but also allows for smaller gatherings for the individual years, to kind of give a much more casual or informal gathering area instead of such a rigid and kind of uptight way to do it. And then we kind of carried that through to our idea of how these things are even tectonically developed. So dealing with structure that starts to have irregular spacing, the kind of triangulation is not based on any kind of optimized principle. It's based on just I guess the projection of particular formal effects, so it feels too heavy, using columns of different sizes to make up for both the inefficiencies of the structure, but then also to produce a kind of hurried effect. So some things are very thin, they obviously seem like they're much more suited for their role. Some things are heavy, but there's a kind of lack of continuity to members that actually allows the structure of the architecture to kind of be an artistic object within the work itself. And then the kind of combination with the way that the slab is hollowed out is this kind of like golf ball effect. But it's more of a, it's a circular geometry instead of a tessellated geometry, so even the kind of patternizing of structural effects are dealt with the same way the color patterns are dealt with. It's kind of ill fit. we kind of continued that, but maybe even more simplifying forms. This was a project or a competition project for a daycare center for mentally disabled adults in Sheba, Israel. So there's no permanent residence of this. Basically, it's kind of it's open from 8 in the morning. It closes at 6. And adults that are no longer, they're not able to kind of entirely care for themselves, come here, get therapy, interact. The idea is for us was to kind of develop a campus that doesn't institutionalize the program so much, so that it feels less hospital-like, and it also feels less even school-like. So the entire daycare center is to service 74 adults. Those are broken down into 12 different pods that service about eight or so adults each day. So the idea is that each of those would take on a kind of autonomous form that we then just would allow to casually scatter throughout the site to produce individual orientations, individual and kind of privatized courtyards, but at the same time allows for circulation throughout the entirety of it. And then to use color as a way not to provide any kind of indexing of the shapes, but to unify the whole thing as a kind of separate study. So just some kind of details of the plans where you have a very kind of normative interior arrangement. These just kind of these square rooms for the care facilities, but then these really kind of unique informal courtyard spaces that both unite the spaces, but also provide separation between them. And then the interior is kind of developed as these muted or kind of pastel-y colors, so they're a little bit more friendly, I guess, in that sense. They all have these kind of light towers. This was a very low budget project. This was all done in kind of cast in place concrete, and the idea is that towers were ways to bring more illumination in with less windows, in a sense, so that the interior of these things could still be very private for the users of it, but it could still get the benefit from more illumination. And then it also allowed for a little bit more of an elevational identity of the entirety of the site and to kind of help it stand out a little bit. And so you just get some photographs of these things, and the way that the colors kind of don't seem to relate to any particular effects of the geometry themselves, but as though it's an overlaid secondary pattern or kind of a painting in itself. And so, trying to kind of continue with these ideas, this was a project for a sculpture park in Queens. This was a small little competition. We took third or fourth. We were a kind of honorable mention, whatever that. We didn't get to build it. But it was a small little sculpture park in Queens that has permanent works by people like Isamu Noguchi. And the idea was for a temporary installation that that was basically, the brief was temporary installation. We decided to use these kind of wooden members and to produce a project that feels like it's organized and sorted the same way you would deal with small blocks or children's blocks or boxes in your house with books, but then to scale it up so massively that they are enormously heavy feeling and quite literally heavy objects that feel improperly positioned for the significance of their stature. So sometimes you get things stacked on top of each other. Other times they're certainly crooked from each other. They kind of don't really follow any particular pattern. The significance of the size is important in the sense that the organization is so cluttered and messy. It seems very inadvisable to do something like this. I guess a kind of similar analog would be for the regulations to which shipping containers are packed and stacked, and it's very kind of clean, and it's done because those things are big and heavy and be organized. And this was to do the exact opposite, to kind of treat something of a certain weight as though it was very light and insignificant. So I think, part of what all of this leads up to is maybe an ambition to have architecture appear as a kind of novelty that subverts its own stature and size, so it seems very minor. unimportant, not maybe even like kind of in ways maybe even uninteresting or maybe anti-ambitious. So I would say not architecture without ambition, but a kind of architecture that's ambition is to not be the center of attention, to be these kind of misguided side projects or these kind of like medium-sized interventions that can develop a fandom or a kind of like level of interest that isn't big but also isn't nothing. And we tried that out kind of as a housing scheme for this competition that we did in a small town in Russia. So this is like the 1 week a year when everything is not like this, gray and brown. So most of the pictures they sent us of the site were like this, very beautiful. And this is the way it actually is when we were there. So it's mostly kind of ugly. And what they wanted is a kind of rich diversity of buildings, or these kind of like singular modernist housing projects that look like a very thoughtful and designed project. So we kind of took their different density prescriptions and kind of came up with the amount of housing that we needed, and then instead of appropriately kind of like deploying it across the site, the idea is to give every building more or less a percentage of unobstructed perimeter, and we did this via kind of a software tool, and then to run a set of just like irregular associations on the site so they can touch, but that then produces space with other buildings. So you get a very disorganized, messy, unthoughtful, kind of unconscious planometric organization that then produces the kind of program difference. So this kind of center has much more office space. The exterior, this is at ground level, the exterior has more retail space. Above it's housing and all these things. And what that supposedly would allow us to do is to produce basically one type of housing density, but allow for a variability of density across the site that then also produces a site plan that is both suburban kind of in nature in the middle of the city, but also anti-everything. It's kind of like, which would then in turn produce a circulation plan, a kind of like usage plan for the residents that's much more friendly and maybe kind of casual and neighborly. So maybe just kind of some studies of the shapes. And then one rendering, two renderings to see what would happen with different facade types. So basically, the idea is that this is more of a zoning project. So we actually had no care about the architecture of any individual building. It was the whole notion of the way that the buildings could interact with each other would produce a particular feel for the site that didn't matter of the results of the construction of these things. So, projects, at least this project, the idea was that it would be built in 5 to 6 phases, probably with maybe one contractor, but who knows how many, different projects they build. But the nature of the site plan would be that regardless of the individual qualities of the architectural construction, the overall site would always feel the same. It should be kind of very loose. So we did, the last 2 projects are these kind of small projects that came up this summer. One is a tiny little installation for this big street fest in Chicago in a neighborhood called Wicker Park. I guess it's Chicago's, it's not its oldest, but it's its largest street fest or street fair. There's about 3 million people over 3 days that kind of go through this thing. There's food and music and stuff like that. And we were asked to produce 2 ceremonial gates that would produce kind of performing art space in between them. So since nothing can be kind of permanent and different parts of the different street have different feelings, they wanted these gates so that you knew when you entered one area, you would be in something else. So the street is 60 feet wide, the sidewalks are 15 feet wide, so we had 90 feet of space and a $2,500 US dollar budget to do it. So our idea was that we wouldn't ever be able to produce a gate that worked as a gate, because it would always be easier to go around anything than to go through it. So our idea would be to kind of produce a jokey gate. It's kind of there, these kind of clumsy towers. Also is this kind of abstract framing that then gets colored maybe inappropriately. So this was a very quick project, but we basically just did the same production type, 14 feet tall. But you can always see through it. Let me just have, this is it. So with people, it's a little different. These kind of funny things. A lot of people seem to like to smoke cigarettes in it. Very few people went through it. People would either go in it or around it, which is fine. The idea that like you these kind of carpenter connections that through the way they were replicated improperly would actually start to produce a joinery that was a little bit more interesting than you might have. The last project's a little bit bigger, and it was done with a friend of mine, Paul Anderson, who did a workshop here, so some of you may have took that workshop or saw him speak. I don't know if he showed this. I don't think he showed this slide because I never gave it to him. But there's a festival that Denver has had a couple of years called the Biennale of the Americas. And it's a kind of cultural festival to unite art from Latin, South America, and North America. And there's a particular night called Music and Animals, at which they asked Paul and I to produce some kind of pavilion for it. So they had a budget of $12,000. It had to be built within a single day and taken down the very next morning. So we needed to do something that was kind of small, more or less easy to construct, because we weren't able to be started until 8 a.m. and it needed to be done by 1 p.m. So we thought we would do a set of barns. And trying to kind of figure out how we can do a barn that's both quick, but also adaptive to, you know, my particular interest and his kind of tertiary interests of strange familiarities. The idea would be to take a very kind of conventional prefabricated barn typology, these kind of hay barns. So in the US now we have these kind of steel barns that you just throw hay or tractors under. And then to combine either different radiuses of the arch or different configurations to kind of give a new object that starts to kind of feel like it's maybe bigger and weirder than the initial history of the park. So these were just some early studies. As the budget became clear, we went to just 2 and we kind of changed the heights of them, and then for a number of reasons went down to the same size. But what we thought we would do is kind of produce 2 barns that didn't quite sit next to each other politely. So they were kind of offset from each other and they were at different angles to each other. And what this did for us was, with 2 covered spaces, it allowed us to produce 9 collective site spaces. So we had both the kind of like interiors of these. We had these moments where there's a kind of shared interior, and these moments where there's a kind of in-between space that you get as an offset. And then we kind of commissioned an artist to do, there's this artist that makes plants that you eat. But she was going to have this kind of like feast of plants in the middle. So then it kind of had a particular purpose with this table that goes through it. And then one other idea would be to kind of grow the grass around it in a particular pattern and mow the grass everywhere else, so it feels a little bit we would have much longer grass in that area, and we were going to work with the park district. And we did, and for like 5 weeks we were growing the grass everywhere, and they were only going to cut the one thing, and then they cut all of it because there was a new guy mowing the lawn and he didn't know. So anyway, so they mowed all of the grass. So this is assembling it together. So we've got all these kind of parts where they kind of had it professionally painted on the interior so that it didn't look like a kind of fundamental agricultural product, but it had a kind of auto body finish on the interior that would get, this was peach, or the color I think was called pink salmon or something. It was just anodized on the end. These things were mounted to these like nicely finished wood railroad ties, so it was a little bit taller. when put together. And you get these, this is kind of a perspectival image when it was kind of just finished of the two things together. So what was interesting is you get this project that is kind of very, very tiny, but while recognizing the similarity of the two units, they're never able to be viewed from the same perspective, and they always produce these kind of new spaces in between. And even the perspectives through individual barns seem to produce a kind of odd illusion of the second barn being shorter or cut off. I always kind of feel like they should be longer, just the detail of the mounting and some uses at night. And you get these kind of, the different angles allow one side to be much more truncated than the other in perspective. People had fun in it and ate those plants that you see. It just tasted like lettuce. But there was something artistic about the plants. And yeah, it was kind of like in between. Anyway, I never know really like how to appropriately end lectures, so I'm done. But I don't really have a point. I don't think, I guess especially like thematically right now, I don't think architecture is much more interesting when it doesn't have any kind of summary comments. It's a kind of continually fascinating oddity within our world. I don't quite know how to summarize the new ambitions into anything that makes, that seems important. But, this is kind of where both the work started, where it went through, purpose-wise, and where it is, which is this kind of exploration of modest ambitions or kind of anti-ambitions to produce weird, like kind of these weird personal or kind of suburban feeling spaces within the city, and also for architecture to start feeling less like a kind of piece of technology or something you use, and more something you have, I guess. The same way like you have a pet rock or something like that. I think like architecture and design in general, like for me, seems like an entertainment field now more than it feels like a kind of pragmatic discipline. I don't really think architecture is art or science in that sense. It's kind of a third body, but I guess like both of those, its job is to kind of reflect back on the circumstances that it's within and develop maybe a kind of sense of humor about its imperfections, which maybe produces a little bit more of a kind of novelty and feeling. I have a dog, a small dog, he's a little Italian greyhound. And I've always kind of been, I had dogs as a kid, but the point of this is I was always kind of really interested in dogs, mostly because I like hanging out with my dogs. But at some point about 3 or 4 years ago, I started watching a lot of movies or documentaries on dogs and kind of learning about the history of how we get them. And more or less like 80 to 85,000 years ago, there was wolves. And then the wolves would kind of eat the garbage that civilizations would put like on the outskirts of their towns. And as the wolves got more courageous, they would come closer into the cities. And people would throw rocks at them. But eventually, like they came close enough that they were captured somehow or turned into, they were more docile and friendly. Anyway, they were then quickly put to use for agricultural purposes, hunting, defense purposes. And then the history goes that more or less over 85,000 years, minus 180, we developed about 70 to 80 different breeds of dogs. And each one of those breeds was very precisely developed and purposed to do something, whether it was like to hunt bear, get rabbits out of holes, and so the head shapes were changed, the body shapes were changed, there were kind of like free effects you get from it, coat patterns were changed, so dogs that were used to like hunt fowl were selected for coat reasons that shed water, that's why they're longer. Anyway, so over 85,000 years we get 80 types of dogs. Generous, let's just say 100 types of dogs. And then, and life was pretty tough for everybody back then. Unless you were a king, the rest of your life sucked. But you had these dogs. Sometime around the Victorian England happened, and wealth has been shifted from owning land to these kind of other things. Like the birth of the financial industries happened, and you get the establishment of the middle class in Victorian England, which both has money, but also for the first time, free time. So kings had free time, but there weren't very many of them. But the middle class, there was a lot of them. So they started taking on dogs, but not to do things, because they didn't need them to hunt, they just needed them to hunt. So they took on dogs as companions. So dogs became pets as opposed to staff. And then in the last 200 years, we've developed over, I think we're now at 1,200 different breeds of dogs. So there's 850 formally recognized types of dogs, and there's another 300 informal hybrids of these dogs. So these trendy dogs like Labrapoodles and stuff like that. What I found really kind of interesting is that for 85,000 years, we couldn't figure out anything more than 80 types of dogs. But the minute we no longer need dogs to do anything for us, we have an enormous need for a diversity of type. And I kind of think architecture went through this same predicament, which is architecture served a very pragmatic and purposeful function for a long time. It did things, whether it housed trains or slaves or whatever. It had both nice and terrible things that it did, and the development of it was based explicitly on what it was supposed to be used for and the materials it was to be made out of. Probably in the last maybe 90 years, we've come to realize that function is a very flexible thing in architecture. Mostly through the kind of in developed world's repurposing of explicitly designed previous functions. So in the US, you have churches being made into apartments or bowling alleys being turned into bars, all of these types of things. So function no longer means anything because it can always be something else equally well, or maybe even better. I think churches make much better nightclubs than they do places to worship a God. Anyway, so I think function became no longer meaningful. I think materials started to be a little bit more understood and less purposeful and more easily manipulated. And I think once we untethered architecture from a particular purpose, in the last now 30 years, we've had a real explosion of diversity of type. And I think most of that due because architecture just satisfies a particular urban entertainment industry. So, in part, I think this is my contribution to that, which is the entertainment not as spectacle, but the kind of belief that architecture has character and a kind of human sensibility that understands maybe funny misery or things like that, or kind of awkward shapes, or the kind of way you feel when you're 15 and trying to go on a date and nothing works, your arms don't work or something. So, some further ruminations. But what I really like is to have questions or accusations. So what do you think? I know you don't have a question.
No, I have a question.
I have a question. What would it be?
You might not ask if you feel uncomfortable.
No, I'm always uncomfortable.
No, I find I saw your work some years ago. And I knew your work from before, and I knew the new face. Mm-hmm. And it's been the first time in many years that I saw something really new. But also, you mentioned you were sick.
Yeah.
Is that sudden change from one, I don't want to call it style, from one search to another search related? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's so.
You don't have to ask if you feel uncomfortable.
No, I don't care.
Okay.
I got cancer at some point, which is a very horrible thing. Anyway, I'm not there. So it's okay. But it's certainly one of those illnesses that makes many other things seem kind of not such a big deal. So a lot of the change came at that time. I don't think it was explicitly connected. It's not like this is post-cancer work.
No.
But it's certainly, I think, work where the certain like self-seriousness about digital production and architecture started to seem foolishly egocentric and less human. It seemed to satisfy too many desires of the author over the point of the results. So maybe, I think the work became smaller, like not in necessarily size, but smaller in idea as a way to make it more funny, right? So things seem like at a time when everything is getting more complicated or sophisticated because of technologies and our like wealth of historical understanding, to start producing a work that is kind of explicitly trying to be dumber seems like a really funny thing to do. But one also that doesn't, I think like the one that doesn't, the typical way that that's done is the kind of nostalgic or romantic way, right? To return to historical types,
yes.
To return to natural materials or things like that, to return to more ordinary methods of design production and things like that. So I don't have any real interest in nostalgia or history, and I think I don't like drawing by hand very much. So all of these are kind of the results of maybe contemporary production techniques and new materials to produce dumbness. Right? So it's not a kind of nostalgic practice. It's, I think, a much more subtly advanced practice, but also one that I think no longer cares about being important, one that wants to just be really funny, I think. But maybe funny like in an architectural way, so not funny like as in a very great comedian way, right? I think those always have a kind of history. Things that will always feel slightly out of place. Like they'll never quite fit in. And maybe they're never big in ideas enough to reposition the expectations people bring to architecture, right? So certainly the Frank Gehry's Guggenheim in Bilbao was out of place at the beginning. But I think, it had such a presence and effect that it's changed people's expectations. So it no longer feels inappropriate or bizarre or foreign. It just feels now expensive. Right? And I think you have a massive proliferation of those projects around the world. Right? Like without that particular project, you don't get the Zaha we have today, which goes everywhere. All of which to say to me is like, no one fights those things anymore, right? So I think it's great for these 70-year-old architects to do those types of things. They're old and people are throwing money at them, so they should do that. But it also started to feel weird for me as an architect who's almost 40 but not yet to be pursuing the same things that people almost twice my age are. Right? Like I remember growing up, my parents, well still, but they really didn't like the music or television shows I was interested in because they just thought it was sloppy or noisy. So it feels weird to now, like, at least like a couple of years ago, it felt weird to be an architect doing things that people who are my parents' age are also doing. Like something seems really inappropriate, like just stupid. Like if we're younger, we should be doing things that they don't understand, right? Their agenda is not my agenda. And it doesn't mean I don't appreciate the work, but I think it's different to appreciate it and then to take it on, right? Like I think we need to kind of figure out what younger agendas for architecture are. And for me, they can't be just about very complicated shapes, or things that seem like they take a lot of effort to produce. But because of software and money, they're producible. I think that's really fascinating in a kind of science way. But as a cultural thing, it seems not so mysterious. Right? But I think there are, like, I don't know, there are lots of projects that are just kind of weird and dumb and don't seem to fit into any category or cliche of what architecture is. And I guess that's what I think is more interesting to me now, like something that isn't part of a party. Part of that's has nothing to do with even being sick. It's just my own personal defects as a person, always not wanting to fit in. Makes me uncomfortable when something is too well appreciated, I guess. I don't think these are even, these aren't even successful yet in a way. They're still a little bit too normal and regular. But I think they all have kind of components or qualities that are starting to get at what this thematic life for a weird architecture is. Does that answer I think that answers it.
Well, I think it is pretty clear that there is a critical dimension to what you do, and the humor is part of that, I think. I find that very interesting. I think there's something particularly irritating about parametric architecture and related endeavors, which is that they are so optimistic, optimistic about technology, about I don't know, the socio-political system we live in. They are too well integrated. Maybe they aspire to be a kind of new classicism, in the sense that they represent the energy and the power of the civilization we live in. So I agree that it's annoying. It becomes annoying.
I mean, it's a new conservatism.
Yeah. So I like very much this critical impulse that you are trying to, I don't know, to find a way to express. But I also, that brings us, I think, to a more substantial problem, which is how difficult it might be for architecture to be critical at all, because it is usually so much associated with money and power. Because making architecture requires money, so it is very easy in art to be critical because you can make art with very little money. So when you were showing some of the images, I was thinking glitch art and some kind of I don't know, productions, contemporary productions of the digital culture that take in their hands being critical about the culture we live in. But in architecture, how do you do that? Maybe, well, you can go to a smaller scale, to cheaper constructions, to, I don't know, something that it's closer to art or to installations, but the visible buildings, the landmarks that everyone knows, how possible do you think it is that they become critical in a certain way?
I mean, I think there's different ways to be. First of all, I don't think architecture cannot be critical. I think like if it's architecture, then it's by nature ideological and it has a position, which also means that it's somehow reflective on the state of affairs that it exists in. So it is in some ways a political project and critical. It doesn't, I think it's obviously difficult for, and I don't know necessarily why you would want to, but it's difficult for a project to be critical of its financiers, right? Like, you can't have a project for a big bank that somehow reacts or is anarchist against the financial system. Like, but that's, I think, something different. I think architecture always can be critical or kind of expose assumptions or flaws in how people interact with the buildings, how they interact with the neighbors to the buildings, or things like that. So I don't know. There's a photo project that a friend of mine, Alex, and I did when we were in Los Angeles this spring, where we drove by. We just made a list of 100 important projects. Right? We weren't very we weren't super disciplined. We didn't want to just say like the 10 important projects, because then we would have to come up with reasons. So we just picked 100 projects that are more or less all we agreed upon that are important buildings, like the Curtis Enos House by Frank Lloyd Wright, Tom Main's buildings. And what we did is that in Marcelo Spina's gallery, like the gallery, prison gallery, and then we were only interested in taking pictures of the really normal buildings that were the neighbors of these things. But I think like the kind of juxtaposition that these like expressive, clearly like ornamental projects produced, when you start viewing them in the immediate context of its much more banal neighbors, like also shows that these projects are kind of critical in a way. Like they're a refutation of maybe a different way of working. So I don't know. I mean, I think it can. I don't think money buys criticality. I think it buys size. So you can't do CCTV for $4,000. But I don't think even if you triple the budget for it, you know, Gourmet's CCTV project, it's critical because of the ideology of the project itself, not the budget or material finish for it. I mean, architecture is a weird moving target, and there's lots of parts. So I think unlike art, which is much simpler of a mechanism, there's the artist, he does something, and there's a very direct audience for it. And that audience literally stands in front of it and looks at it, right? And then there's the kind of interaction. I think architecture works differently. There's people who use the building, there's people who use a building next to a building, and they see it that way. There's people who only see it on the television. I think like the audience is much more diverse. There's people who use the building because they work there to clean it for other people working there. Like there's so many different ways you can kind of interact with an architectural project that it's not quite even easy to identify who the constituency for a piece of architecture is. That I think the kind of illusion of audience in architecture is a big problem. You feel like there's somebody who's paying for it, but he's not even necessarily the product for it. And again, I think the kind of elasticity of the program makes the planning of a project seem even kind of irrelevant anymore. Like lobbies are whatever. Lobbies are more or less these kind of a-program spatial types that are also used for churches or trades. You know, they're just big open spaces. So I don't even think there's there's no specificity to architecture at this point in the way. So I think like the only thing it could actually be is as kind of critical. I don't know if that is. I kind of got off the original topic. I think you were saying you really like the work, and I was saying thank you.
I like it.
No, I don't know. You know, I mean, like, these projects are small, and they have a small budget because as a small, starting a new office, like, you only get small projects, or I only started to get them. I think they're not critical in ways that other projects are, but they're more critical about a kind of, like, set of expectations people bring to architecture.
Something, I think it's
and it's not worked out. I mean, like there's an enormous amount of self-understood holes in all of this because it's something that I mostly have a hunch is right, and I'm trying to like work through these instincts to figure out like how it could actually happen.
Something that I see in your description of the work is that there is, I mean, it's kind of a profound acknowledgement of the state of the art, profound to the point of accepting kind of in a big way certain weaknesses that contemporary culture has constructed, in which you yourself assume to have taken part in that. And I think it's a kind of profound and courageous to do that. That is agile as well to do it in such a short period of time as you seem to have done it. So I mean, in that sense, I feel very not only sympathetic but also I admire that kind of attitude. At the same time, I wonder. I'm trying to look for the problem.
Yeah.
No? I wonder if how that attitude can be sustained in time, basically, without falling into its own argument, kind of problems or argumentations.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for its own weaknesses,
right,
let's say, as an argument. So in that sense, one of the weaknesses I find, I mean, I tell you not to be critical, but just to kind of construct something else out of that. One is that many of the categories you use, I was writing down even the last 15 minutes of those categories. You probably mentioned a huge number of categories, but not to be center of attention, unpretentiousness, clumsiness, not precisely related, disorganized, messy, toyish, anti-everything, no care about the architecture of a particular building, regardless of individual qualities, goofy, jokey, improperly replicated, unpolitely sitting, and so on, no? Dumber. I mean, a lot of qualities that you seem to value, no? And many of them are negative, well, many of them are literally negative, no? Like not doing something.
Right.
Or I was wondering, and some of them are qualitative and somehow affirmative, but in a weak sense, like clumsy or dumb.
Yeah.
So one could say that the discourse can fall into a certain form of evasiveness that is a dead end at some point. It becomes a dead end at some point because it's like it kind of it can get exhausted as an evasive attitude. You know that, and then when you mention some of the more literally affirmative qualities, you mention human. You said human or friendly or casual or neighborly. Those are more kind of more clearly affirmative ones. No, so no, I was just wondering about that. The affirmative condition of the discourse and the form making. No, the how. Yeah, I mean, if it can sustain in time, itself in time, being only negative or being sort of putting itself in the weak side of architecture.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't. I mean, I don't really see it as. I mean, in the way you described it, I think it's described as negative. I don't think it's negative in the sense of producing a kind of opposite of positive.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's work that's looking for a set of values that's outside of the kind of conventional way that architecture is and has always been discussed, which is a kind of form of perfection, right? So I think architecture is always especially because I think architecture is not just a building, but it's an idea of a building. I think as such, the history of architecture is always searching for the kind of perfection of an ideal manifest in a set of materials that produce a very large object. So every architectural client like that you learn when you study the history of architecture, past and present, and types and regions and like parts of the world, like it's always trying to produce a kind of perfect object or a kind of beautiful object. And I think the only times that it doesn't explicitly do that is when the architect or the society is kind of finds a momentary interest in the exact opposite, like the grotesque or something like that. The problem with that is you're still in the exact same dialogue. So, if you're interested in beauty, having an interest in the grotesque doesn't negate an interest in beauty because you're using a kind of negative of it as a way to kind of form a positive. So there was one thing I was going to kind of show. There's a philosopher, I think he's like 84 years old now, something, in New Jersey and Harry Frankfurter, and he put an essay out like in the 80s that I never heard about because I was a kid. A couple of years ago, he put it into a book, and it's called Bullshit. And the entire book is basically on the concept of bullshit. And his description is that there's people who tell the truth, and they kind of believe in this moralistic ideal, like there's a truth to believe in, and they tell it. And then there's people who tell lies, and they're jerks, but also, by definition, they're enormously invested in the truth also, because they're telling the opposite of the truth. And then his idea of bullshit is it's a very kind of novel category because it doesn't matter whether it's true or false, right? Like, there's just a particular agenda that's trying to be advanced by who the person is, and he's using whatever rhetorical techniques he can to convince the audience of its attractiveness. So whether what he's telling you is true or not is of entirely no concern to the person who's telling bullshit. So anyway, I think it's kind of funny as a like investigation into types of conversation. But for me, what I thought is kind of interesting is that architecture is either about trying to produce a construction purity, whether it's like a structural efficiency or a visual beauty, or an organizational beauty, like the notion of the kind of program diagram that works seamlessly and optimizes people's use and integration with it. And it's kind of, I think not improperly, but unfortunately is mostly concerned with the kind of definition of correct, or kind of like perfection. The only times it deviates from that is when it explores the opposite of that, to produce something like ugly or grotesque or gnarly, but all of that is, none of that investigation is even possible without not just an awareness of beauty, but also a deep respect for beauty to try and produce the opposite of it. So the kind of interest in like skulls or death or things like that is really just reaffirming an interest in life and flesh and things. So what hopefully like all of this work is getting to is something that it's outside of that as a conversation. And architecture doesn't have to be about beautiful things, and it doesn't have to be about ugly things. It can be about, it's, and I don't think this is something for a wide audience either, but it can be something that's atonal, like it's not following a musical scale, and it's not subverting the musical scale. It's indifferent to it. Like it's kind of producing patterns and combinations that aren't really thought through. They're not based on any particular like musical theory. They're kind of based on the ignorance of all of those things. So it's not violent in that sense. And I think that's why like the attractiveness to people who pursue the grotesque is that they somehow feel it's a kind of violent action against beauty, which is viewed as a conservative thing, but it kind of in the end reaffirms the same allegiances, I guess. Because I think this is like, and I guess when I meant anti-everything, that might have been something else, because I don't think this is anarchist work in that sense. Like, I guess when I meant was, I think I was just talking about anti-ambition, which is, so it's worth it, it has concerns. So it's not just trying to be construction, like build and then move on, but it's not something that has ambitions of grandeur. It's not trying to be so significant it reconfigures the entire world. I think it's actually finding interest in being something that will never be important.
Is that possible? I mean, in architecture. I mean, in the sense that
it's possible in like most of the artists and musicians that I like are not super famous. Right? And I think they probably never will be because their work is it's sometimes too difficult, or it's not clear what its motivations even are. So I think it develops a certain level of like appreciation, but never enough that it's palatable by a lot of people. So I think like in architecture that's got to be true too. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of buildings that I see that I really like that no one cares about, but there's something disturbingly about it. Like, it doesn't look like a normal house, like in Chicago. There's like 5 houses in particular. And it's tough to even find out who the architects are because no one cares about it. But I really think the buildings are great. So it's like you have to kind of subvert your artist ego for it. But I think it's possible.
No, I understand that, but I mean, there is a point. I mean, it's a sophisticated construct.
Yeah.
When you are an architect and not a non-architect,
Right. Yeah.
or a non-capital letter architect, let's say. When you are an architect, let's say now you're lecturing in a school of architecture, and you teach in a school of architecture in the context of a number of intellectuals that actually are avant-garde,
right.
Let's say. Despite what you said about the idea of avant-garde, let's say you participate in that.
Right.
So in that sense, pretending that you don't is nothing but a more sophisticated version of doing that. Let's say. I mean, let's say that's what. In that sense, I'm asking if it is possible. In the sense, and also, let's say the renderings are extremely sophisticated in the way they are constructed, so that they produce a certain, very particular form of expression that communicates clumsiness or this or that.
Right.
In that sense, I'm saying that there is a huge sophistication about it, not a lack of care,
Yeah.
let's say.
No, I mean, I think, well, I think it's got to be possible. Like, that's why I'm kind of interested in it. I think the whole, like, idea of avant-garde is personality-driven more than work-driven. So I think it's possible to not participate in that, but still produce work that is critically or ideologically important. I think whether it ends up being Zaha could have easily not been famous, but still been doing what she was doing, you know, and then it might have had a kind of mystique about it or something. So some of that is not up to anybody, right? Like whether an idea becomes appreciative or something. But I think, like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's certainly tricky. One other thing that's tough is that you can be bad at something, and then when you develop, like, the more you work at something, you get better at it. And when you're bad at something, it's just, there's no pleasure in it. Like, it's a kind of problem. So what's difficult to do is to produce conscious, poor quality, right? Like, when you actually, like, as an architect, you know what good architecture is, like, you know, in a very kind of sloppy way to define it, but, like, you know what quality is. So it's very tough to then produce architecture that disavows the consciousness about it. So I think you actually have to be really well studied and precise and work at it to produce things that look informal. So I think that's kind of tough. I find it really tough at a student level, like trying to work these things out as studio projects, even with, you know, graduate students. I think that have a very kind of sophisticated view of culture at our school. Is that student work is kind of bad anyway, like for the most part, and it should be because you're learning it. So I think, like, it's hard to then produce atonal architecture on purpose when you, like, as a student, still can't produce tonal music. Or, like, you can't produce, you can't, you know, if you can't play guitar, you can't then not play guitar as the point of it. You know, you can only not play guitar, and somehow that doesn't quite sound right. So there is a kind of very nuanced relationship between, I guess, you know, something that is correct, but it's outside of it in a way that's quite subtle. You know, I mean, I think I find it difficult to define, I guess, or even to really talk about, because I think being that it is not in a direct relationship to a kind of 100% correct or 100% incorrect thing, somehow the vocabulary hasn't quite been developed to even talk about these things. I mean, so it seems kind of strange. So I guess it gets affirmative when I talk about it, when I relate it to kind of human qualities or emotional things, right? Like neighborly, ways that are certainly pleasant, but at the same time not extremely joyful. Neighborly isn't something great, but it's not hostile. It's kind of just weird pleasantry about it. So I don't know, but there's something that's kind of really, to me, fascinating about things that are let's say, not normal, but they're also not spectacular. There's something that's got to be between the two of those things. And I don't know quite what that is, and so I've been working around the idea that, I think architecture is a formal practice and a material practice, so I guess I've been trying to solve it as a problem of color and shape and composition. But yeah, I mean, it's gotta be there, because I think if there's anonymous architecture, which let's just say is the most overused types, normal houses and normal office buildings, and there's clearly avant-garde spectacular work that's meant to be iconic and singular and individual. There has to be something that's neither of those two things. It's neither a superhero and it's neither a regular person. It's somehow a third type. And I think the inability for me to properly articulate that right now is because the entire way we look at anything culturally is on that scale of anonymity to uniqueness, right? So I think, especially in the US, I was part of the first generation of babies that's brought up being told you're special all the time. It's really weird, and now it's horrible. Every kid in America thinks that he's unique, which is the funniest thing. But so I think so we're now on that extreme end, but in the 50s, and it was the opposite, where everyone was just taught they're kind of part of the exact same thing. But somehow that always misses a real component, which are people who just don't fit in. So I think there's got to be a way you can actually produce architecture that doesn't fit in. Because I know when I was in high school, you could produce a type of person that didn't fit in. They listened to weird music or something, or they wore suits when no one else wore suits. So it's not even anything robustly performative. It just doesn't fit the time. So I also think what that is going to change. I think it's a moving target, right? So in 20 years, I think weird architecture won't look like what, even if this was right, it shouldn't look like this, because at some point that becomes absorbed in the, I don't know. I mean,
I have another question.
Yeah.
Which is, I was wondering, because you were showing all these images one after another very quickly, the digital model parts, the renderings, and describing them sometimes with more attention, sometimes with less attention. I mean, they were student work as well, many of them, so probably they were not the same quality for you. So my question there would be, so in that sense, one can also say that those were at the service of illustrating your ideas, to some extent, rather than at the service of differentiating your ideas. In the sense, I was wondering about the use of the word unique that you were saying. That, for example, are you searching for unique forms of goofiness that then would challenge the generality of the notion of goofiness? Still far too general. Of course, it's not heroic and it's not against heroic. It's just goofy, let's say. But then, are the projects developed by you or by your students aimed at constructing more specific and unique versions that are irreducible to the condition of goofiness because they are very particular. And the reason why I'm asking that is that then the sophistication, let's say if between one model and the next, the form of goofiness is different.
Right.
And you may not have the word to describe it, but still they are different.
Right.
Then that form of sophistication becomes highbrow. And I don't know, I just feel for that problem. You know?
I think it is a highbrow problem. I don't like it's not an anti-intellectual project. I think it's a deeply intellectual project. I think it's a very formal project in a sense. I think the reason that I show a lot of images and spend very little time on any individual one, even when so obviously spending very little time on the difference between these means less than when I was going through one portrait of student work, because the difference to them is much more dramatic. Whereas this is just different views of the same project. But I think in part it's to remove the sense of importance from the details of these things, right? So I don't know. One of the things that really I'm gonna use this because I don't want to use this is one thing that started to really get under my skin about the entire parametric problem is then the belief that there's a kind of correct aesthetic product to parametricism, and you would start getting into. And it was horrible, as a critic, to be in reviews at other schools where we would have to spend 3 hours talking about the difference between a curve like that and the difference between a curve like that. Now, we would really spend hours debating these minor differences of small degrees as though they actually matter. And at some point, I don't think they do. I think those curves are also just ideas of a line, in a sense, right? And so whether it's curved one way or the other, is somehow irrelevant. And let me just get to back to some of those things. So, the difference between this and this, in a very practical sense, this is red and yellow and looks like balls under cloth, and this is purple. This has clear edges to the difference in colors. This has a feathered difference. This has weird stacks and things that look like they should topple over. There's a lot of differences to them. I think conceptually to me they're identical. And I guess that's the kind of breezing through all of them while just talking over them together is to more refine the concept of these things. Because I don't know, I think the red and the yellow are only marginally important. This was brown and green, I guess for the goal that I think these things are serving, it would be the same. And I think if there were 4 balls instead of, there are 4, if there were 5 instead of 4, I think it would look the same. I think there would be physical differences to it, but I don't think those differences manifest in any particular ideological difference. And I actually think that architecture's audience, all of them, is subconsciously much more and intuitively much more sophisticated in how they appreciate architecture, which is at an ideological level. So I think the details actually matter less in certain senses. And I think the kind of generalities of organization patterns are. And that might not be true, but somehow it kind of seems true to me. I think it seemed more true to me when I actually talk with clients. Somehow they don't seem, things that to me used to seem dramatically different, the difference between this and this, they don't actually see those differences so much. Other things they kind of see really deeply. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an intellectual practice, but I think it's kind of a material practice to find something that always just doesn't quite fit. So by definition, that's going to have to change as well, because the cultural expectations of what we bring to, or what we expect an architecture to be, continually changes slightly. But I think the range that it changes is different. I think politics of our expectations for architecture is always like a image of perfection. What that is means different things, certainly to different people, but I think the root expectation is always the same. So this is, I think, an interest in lack of that. Like not even imperfection, because it's not trying to just find things that are wrong. I guess that's why like the house turning upside down seems to do it, right? Like it's kind of funny, but it's in direct relationship to a house being right side up. So somehow, all it's doing is reaffirming what's correct, as opposed to introducing a new territory for design.
How would the scale of this?
For this specific thing?
Well, yeah, let's say for this one.
Yeah. I mean, all of these were thought of as like very large objects. So, and some of these I like better than others. Like,
Yeah.
this one's really good. One of my favorites. But I think the idea is like they're intended to be very big things. They're presented both like through the kind of coloration, but then the entire formatting of the image, the fact like these are all renderings, these aren't photographs, but they're meant to look like photographs of things you might put on your lovely bookshelf. Like my mom collects figurine elephants, so they're supposed to look like collectibles. And I think the idea is like you can, but not as a reduction of the real thing. Like these things would just be scaled up, so the effects would be to kind of miniaturize the building in a sense, right? Like it might be 300 meters tall, but the way that it sits in the city, it actually doesn't even look like it's part of the same universe that everything else is. So details are important because those things enable the ideology to be produced. But I guess like when I say details are important, I think at least like especially in Chicago where people think detail means something, I think it tends to fetishize like assembly. Right? So our Chicago like AIA has an award for best detail that it gives out every year. And to me, it always looks like the worst detail. Because it always has like tons of bolts and things, and like the bolts are really expensive in design. But like, I guess for me, like I think a good detail, like if a detail actually does what it's supposed to, it should subvert its own identity to like the collectivity of the product, right? So you shouldn't actually see anything. I think drywall seams are probably like the best detail in architecture because you just see like the entire wall. You don't see the panels of drywall and tape and plaster. So I think that detailing is important, but only in the sense that you're not aware something was detailed.
Have you been exploring how to build these kind of things? Because when you show your work, your build work, there's a lot of detail, or you show your details, and they are very different.
Sure. I mean, they're different for a couple reasons. Like, I think scale matters, right? So, what's a visible detail on something that's supposedly as big as this particular project claims to be? That doesn't mean you wouldn't even see a seam between windows. It wouldn't be expressed or kind of like celebrated. I think in the kind of built work, I mean, the other thing is like, one starts to look at the ambition and tries to chart out what the design goals are, in a sense, or even kind of figure out the genre of the work. And then the build work tries to produce those things. So I just started, I guess. These things all confronted annoying realities like budget and time. Both of them were installations that needed to be put together within a very short period of time and have very little money. So some things, sometimes you just choose not to care about certain battles. So I don't like that you see things like all the little ridiculous. But at the same time, it wasn't so important to me removing that would have meant that we would have been able to do it. So there's other things that were more important, like figuring out the kind of generalities of organization and misalignment at a scale that people are actually in it. So I didn't care about the ridiculous this time.
But you talked about this perceptual product at all.
Yeah.
And I think there is a field to explore in how these things may be built.
Yeah, I do too. I mean,
maybe like this will.
These are attempts to do it, and I think they're problems with them. But that's also okay. I think there's a weird perception now, for at least I mean, I don't know, basically going to school at this point makes it seem like when you start doing architecture that it should all be the best project in the world, right? And I think you don't want everything to be that way. I think there needs to be some sloppiness so that you can kind of focus on certain smaller parts in individual projects. So that, with a real project, you have there's costs, there's time, there's real money, there's getting materials and stuff like that. So certain things I just didn't care about. So I don't like the ridiculous, but they're there. But also, before you do it, you don't even know if you would care. So there's certain things that I didn't bother with because I thought it might not work, but I also thought maybe that would be okay. But then you see it and they give they produce shadows that are kind of obnoxious. But that's okay. I bet Iron Maiden's playing right now, and I'm sure he's going to make a few mistakes when he sings, and it'll be fine.
I have a question. I've seen something that I've never seen before. I'm quite new in architecture, but I've seen something that you treat many things with feelings and not global feelings, like many artists or architects treat things or representation of things that many people understand as one thing or one feeling. And you've mentioned many times personal feelings, and you relate it directly to your work. My question is, do you think that the color, shape, and composition, that's another thing you mentioned lots of times, could be solved or developed by own feelings and leaving aside a technique or a thing that most architects or artists always talk about to show the perfection of their ideas and pointing the details many times, and you don't. I mean, in the way you show your pictures always very fast. So my question is about feelings and finding.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I think work, any kind of artistic work, if it's good, tends to be deeply personal. So then it should be really closely tethered to your own interests and not done as a kind of architecture is a profession, but I think it has to not be clinical. At that same time, I think I don't think I'm unique. So I think everyone should trust that as long as you do something that's your own interest, there should be at least one other person on the earth that finds that good too, and probably more. So that's why I think I don't know. I mean, the color selection is both personal, but it's also somewhat arbitrary. I think the personalization of the color is mostly to make sure that it doesn't accidentally match, more so than it is to come up with a routine to always pick things that don't match or something like that. And I guess that's I think the editing or the kind of professional skill that I'm hoping to bring to producing irregular work is just to make sure that you don't, I mean, if things are truly arbitrary, then sometimes you should get things that just match perfectly, right? The problem is that then that looks like you just made something that matches perfectly. So mostly when I pick arbitrary colors, the only personal choice is to make sure that they don't happen to be the right place on a color scale anyway. So I do that kind of rather crudely or something. Like the project for Greece, basically I took a set of Sherwin-Williams home interior paint recommendations from the catalog they put out in 1982, just because I found it, and the color combinations for a 1974 Ford Mustang. You had like 4 colors. So I thought that way, like at least I would get 2 color palettes that do not have any, they don't match, right? Like they're for 2 different types of things, a house and a car, and they're from 10 years apart in style, so there's no way they should match. But then in the end, like the brown and the Mustang seemed to work fine with the other things. So then you had, I had to do some personal choices to change that up. So it's mostly just to, with color and things, is to make sure that you don't accidentally make things that look good. I mean, I think they look good, but I think they look good in a different way, right? I don't think the work is about subverting pleasure. I think it's trying to find new forms of pleasure. That's sort of pleasure in formalisms that aren't conventional.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
If you go back to the models of students, why do most of them have they have, well, some of them they have an object and a background. Some of them they have an object, a plate, and a background. Like that, like this one,
Yeah,
or like the plates there, those plates.
Yeah. So I don't know, the first 12 of these were all done by the same studio. So I think since these were, we were just trying to kind of work with different things. So this one was done by John Dillon, who actually in a book that I just saw, he had a project for movies, and was in it. So the idea here was that the projects have a base, whether that's a clause or something, it's the immediate context of the kind of city it's within. So he just produced these things as kind of a circle, so they look like displayed. And then kind of change the color of it. So some people didn't do that at all. They used the, technically the way we kind of rendered these was to think of them as product shoots. When they bring a car into photograph it for a magazine, it's always on this kind of weird infinity background. So, and they're out of order, but so I think then some students just decided to make the background produce that kind of urban connection. And then, some people did both, and had partial patterns. I think the main effect was so that it doesn't seem, so that it actually feels kind of like a photograph of a small collectible, as opposed to a rendering of an architectural object. Right? So somehow just to reinforce the idea of this as an image, to make it seem that you can hold it in your hand or something. So later on, I think he just didn't put the plate on there. He was just more interested in kind of using the backdrop for the entire thing. This was a more recent studio, and then we just removed any kind of articulation of the backdrop. So it was just the object. I think these things made interesting images, but I think it actually started to confuse the idea of the architecture in that sense. Like it started to be, I don't know, to me these started to feel more like art at this point. I mean, it's a really like small difference, but at this point they still seemed more about the object itself. Here it started to be more about the composition. So in more recent ones, like they did that. You know, like originally I did it, this was before the studio, but as a kind of total design. So that's why. I mean, I think they're just like testing different results.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.